When did you thank your stalker and everything went sideways? The manila envelope was taped to my apartment door when I got home from the gym at 6 in the morning. No postage, no return address, just my name written in blocky capitals across the front. Inside were printed screenshots of bank transfers between my business partner Grayson's personal account and shell companies I'd never heard of. Amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 going back 3 years. A sticky note said, "He's stealing from you. Check the Singapore accounts." I threw the whole thing in my recycling bin and texted Grayson that some psycho was trying to start trouble. He called immediately, laughing about jealous competitors, and we agreed to grab coffee before our investor meeting that afternoon. The second envelope appeared 4 days later, slid under my office door. This one had lease agreements for properties I didn't recognize and expense reports for renovations we'd never discussed. Our real estate development company had 12 properties in various stages of completion, but these addresses weren't in our portfolio. Another sticky note read, "He created a second company using your signature. You're liable for everything." I took photos of everything and emailed them to Grayson with the subject line, "Your obsessed ex is getting creative." He responded within minutes saying his former girlfriend Natasha had mental health issues and had been harassing him since their breakup 2 years ago. He'd file for a restraining order if this continued. That weekend, I posted on social media about the anonymous hero trying to sabotage my business with fake documents and conspiracy theories. I wrote a whole thread thanking my stalker for the entertainment and noting that unsuccessful people often tried to tear down those actually building something. I tagged our company account and used hashtags about entrepreneurship and overcoming obstacles. The post got 500 likes and dozens of comments from other business owners sharing their own stories about dealing with jealous competitors. Grayson shared it to his network with a comment about haters being proof you're succeeding. We laughed about it over drinks that night, celebrating our upcoming Series A funding round. The third envelope arrived Monday morning, but this time it wasn't alone. Someone had left 19 identical manila envelopes at my apartment building's front desk, each one addressed to a different resident. The building manager called me down to pick mine up and asked if I knew why someone was mass mailing the building. I opened mine in the lobby and my stomach dropped. Inside were bank statements showing Grayson had been transferring money from our operating account to his personal accounts for over 2 years. Not just small amounts, but hundreds of thousands of dollars disguised as contractor payments and material costs. The statements had my signature on the authorization forms, except I'd never seen these transactions. I ran up to my apartment and started digging through our company files online. The login credentials I'd always used suddenly didn't work. I called our bank and they said someone had changed the security settings 3 weeks ago using my authorization. When I explained I hadn't made those changes, they said they'd need to investigate, but the requests had come from my registered email address with my security questions answered correctly. I hung up and called Grayson, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried his office line and his assistant said he'd called in sick that morning. Something was very wrong. My phone started ringing with calls from other residents in my building asking what these documents meant and why they'd been sent to them. Most of them were confused, but one woman named Patricia, who lived on the 3rd floor, said she worked in forensic accounting and the documents looked legitimate. She offered to come up and review everything with me. We spread all the paperwork across my dining room table and Patricia went through each statement methodically. After an hour, she looked up and said these weren't fake. The transactions were real. The signatures appeared genuine, and if I hadn't authorized them, then someone had been forging my approval on major financial transfers for years. I tried Grayson again, and this time he answered sounding rushed. I told him about the documents and asked him to explain the transfers. He said he was dealing with a family emergency and would call me back, then hung up before I could respond. Patricia heard the whole exchange and said his reaction was exactly what she'd expect from someone caught embezzling. She suggested I contact a lawyer immediately and freeze all company accounts before he could move more money. I called our corporate attorney, who said he'd look into it but seemed skeptical that Grayson would steal from our own company. He reminded me that Grayson had family money and didn't need to embezzle anything. That night I couldn't sleep, so I started going through our company emails searching for anything unusual. I found dozens of messages I didn't remember sending authorizing transfers and approving expenses. The emails came from my account, but I had no memory of writing them. I checked my sent folder and they were all there with timestamps showing I'd sent them during normal business hours. But several were dated when I'd been traveling or in meetings with my calendar proving I couldn't have sent them. Someone had access to my email and had been impersonating me for months or possibly years. The building manager called at 7 the next morning saying more envelopes had been delivered overnight. This time they'd been left at every business on our block, about 35 different companies. Each envelope contained the same financial documents plus new ones, showing the properties Grayson had purchased under a shell company called Meridian Holdings. The company was registered in Delaware with my name listed as a co-founder and guarantor on loans totaling $8 million. I'd never heard of Meridian Holdings and certainly hadn't signed loan documents for $8 million. Patricia came back over and helped me contact the Delaware Secretary of State's office. They confirmed Meridian Holdings existed and sent over the incorporation papers, which had my forged signature all over them. My lawyer called back sounding serious and said we needed to meet immediately. In his office, he laid out documents his paralegal had pulled overnight. Grayson had created 3 separate shell companies using my identity as a cosigner, taking out loans and lines of credit that I was legally liable for. The total exposure was over $12 million. If these loans defaulted, creditors would come after me personally because my name and social security number were on all the applications. He asked if I'd given Grayson power of attorney or access to my personal information. I explained we'd been business partners for 5 years and obviously he had access to company documents, but I'd never authorized him to open accounts in my name. The lawyer said this constituted identity theft and fraud on a massive scale. He'd already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and they were opening an investigation. But he warned that until they could prove Grayson had forged everything, I was legally responsible for all those debts. Our business accounts would likely be frozen during the investigation, meaning I couldn't access any company funds to defend myself or pay for attorneys. He estimated my legal bills would exceed $200,000 if this went to trial. I asked about the mysterious person sending the envelopes, and he said they'd technically committed crimes by accessing financial records and distributing them without authorization. But without them, I might never have discovered Grayson's fraud until creditors started seizing my assets. I went back to my apartment to find 3 people waiting in the lobby with more questions about the documents. 2 were fellow residents, but the third was a man I didn't recognize who introduced himself as Trevor Hollis, an investor in one of the shell companies. He'd received an envelope at his office and wanted to know why his $300,000 investment in Meridian Holdings wasn't showing proper returns. I told him I'd never heard of Meridian Holdings until yesterday and didn't know anything about his investment. Trevor's face went red and he said my signature was all over the investment documents promising 18% returns within 2 years. He pulled out his phone and showed me the emails we'd supposedly exchanged discussing the project timeline and profit projections. Patricia emerged from the elevator and suggested we all go somewhere private to talk. We ended up in my apartment with 6 people who'd invested money in various projects connected to shell companies using my identity. The amounts ranged from $50,000 to $500,000, and none of them had received the promised returns. One woman named Diana had mortgaged her house to invest $200,000 in a supposedly guaranteed development project. She started crying while explaining her husband had left her when he discovered what she'd done. Another investor named Paul said he'd drained his retirement account for what Grayson had described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They all had emails from my account confirming the investments and promising returns. While we talked, my phone kept buzzing with messages from people in the neighborhood and business community asking about the documents. Someone had created a Facebook group called Grayson's Victims and posted all the financial records there. The group already had 200 members and more were joining every minute. People were sharing their own stories about investing with Grayson or working on his projects and never getting paid. A contractor posted invoices totaling $85,000 for work on Meridian Holdings properties that had never been settled. An architect shared drawings for buildings that were never constructed despite Grayson showing investors photos of supposed progress. The FBI agents arrived at my apartment that afternoon, 2 women in suits who sat at my dining table and asked hundreds of questions while taking notes. They wanted to know everything about my relationship with Grayson, how we'd started the business, who had access to what accounts, and whether I'd noticed anything suspicious over the years. I explained we'd met through a mutual friend, and he'd seemed knowledgeable about real estate development. He'd handled most of the financial operations while I focused on project management and client relationships. Looking back, I realized how convenient that division had been for him to operate without my oversight. The agents said they'd been investigating Grayson for 3 months based on a tip, but hadn't had enough evidence until these documents surfaced. I asked who'd sent the tip, and the lead agent named Jennifer said they couldn't disclose their source, but the person had been feeding them information gradually to avoid compromising the investigation. When the documents got distributed publicly, their source panicked and accelerated the disclosure to prevent Grayson from destroying evidence. I realized my social media post thanking my stalker must have spooked whoever was trying to expose him. By mocking them publicly, I'd forced them to go nuclear with the evidence instead of letting the FBI build a proper case. Jennifer confirmed my suspicion and said their source had been trying to work with them to gather enough evidence for a federal indictment. My post made the source worry I'd tip off Grayson, so they dumped everything immediately. The agents spent 3 hours documenting everything before telling me not to contact Grayson under any circumstances. They'd be executing search warrants on his home and offices within 24 hours. They warned that things would get worse before they got better because the investigation would uncover more fraud as they dug deeper. Jennifer said Grayson had likely been running this scam for years before I even met him, using various partners and shell companies to steal millions from investors. I was just his latest front person, though he'd been more aggressive with my identity because I'd been too trusting. She advised me to get a criminal defense attorney in addition to my civil lawyer because prosecutors might try to prove I was complicit. That night, someone knocked on my door at 11. Through the peephole, I saw a woman about my age with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She looked nervous and kept glancing down the hallway. I opened the door with the chain still on and asked who she was. She said her name was Vanessa, and she was the one who'd been leaving the envelopes. She needed to talk to me before the FBI found her. I let her in, and she collapsed onto my couch looking exhausted. She explained she'd been engaged to Grayson 4 years ago and had discovered he was stealing from his previous business partner. When she confronted him, He'd drained their joint account and left her with $40,000 in credit card debt she didn't know existed. Vanessa had spent 2 years rebuilding her credit and investigating Grayson's operations. She'd tracked his pattern of finding new partners, gaining their trust, then using their identities to commit fraud while keeping himself insulated from legal liability. He'd done it to at least 4 people before me, leaving them to deal with criminal investigations while he moved to a new city and started over. She'd been trying to stop him by warning me but didn't want to reveal her identity because Grayson had threatened to claim she was stalking him if she interfered with his business. When I posted that thank you message, she'd panicked thinking I was actually working with him and decided to force everything into the open. I asked why she hadn't just gone to the police, and Vanessa laughed bitterly. She had gone to the police in 3 different cities, and they'd all said it was a civil matter, or that she couldn't prove Grayson had forged anything. He was careful to cover his tracks and had lawyers who'd immediately threaten defamation suits if anyone accused him publicly. She'd finally contacted the FBI 6 months ago, but they said they needed more evidence and time to build a case. She'd been working with them while simultaneously trying to warn me before Grayson destroyed my life the way he'd destroyed hers. My social media post mocking her had made her realize I wouldn't listen to subtle warnings. We talked until 3 in the morning while Vanessa showed me documents proving Grayson's pattern. He'd used the same Delaware shell company structure with all his previous partners. The names changed, but the approach was identical. He'd gain complete access to their financial accounts and email, then slowly start forging authorizations while moving money through complex networks of fake companies. By the time his partners discovered anything, they were already liable for millions in debt and facing criminal charges. Most of them had settled quietly with creditors rather than fight, which let Grayson escape without consequences. Vanessa was determined that I wouldn't become another silent victim. The FBI raided Grayson's office and home the next morning. Vanessa and I watched the news coverage showing agents carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment out of the building where our company was headquartered. My phone exploded with calls from clients, investors, and contractors wanting to know what was happening. The news was reporting a massive fraud investigation but hadn't released names yet. Our company's name was all over the footage, though, and within hours, business contacts were canceling meetings and backing out of deals. Our reputation was completely destroyed before anyone even knew the details. Grayson's lawyer held a press conference that afternoon claiming his client was innocent and being framed by a disgruntled ex-girlfriend with mental health issues. He said Vanessa had been stalking Grayson for years and had fabricated documents to destroy his business because he'd ended their relationship. The lawyer showed text messages where Vanessa had supposedly threatened Grayson and emails where she'd admitted to following him. I watched the press conference with Vanessa and saw her face go white. She said those messages were fake or taken out of context from when she'd been trying to warn his new partners about his fraud. The lawyer was twisting everything to make her look unstable. The FBI agents came back that evening with more questions, and Vanessa voluntarily went with them to give a statement. Jennifer told me they'd found evidence of 8 previous victims beyond what Vanessa had documented. Grayson had been running this scam for over a decade, always moving to new cities when things got too risky. The total amount stolen was estimated at $30 million, but they were still tracing money through offshore accounts and international transfers. They'd arrested Grayson and charged him with wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. His bail was set at $2 million, and they didn't expect him to post it. Within 2 days, Grayson's family posted bail and he was released under house arrest with electronic monitoring. His lawyer immediately filed a restraining order against Vanessa, claiming she was dangerous and had been coordinating with me to frame him. The judge granted a temporary order pending a hearing, which meant Vanessa couldn't go within 500 feet of Grayson or contact him in any way. She called me crying after the hearing, saying his lawyers were going to paint her as a crazy stalker ex while portraying Grayson as the victim. I told her to stay strong because the FBI had all the evidence, but she said she'd seen this pattern before with his previous victims. He'd threaten and intimidate them until they dropped their cooperation with prosecutors. My lawyer called with worse news. The investors who'd been defrauded were filing a class action lawsuit against me personally, claiming I'd been complicit in Grayson's fraud or had been negligently unaware of his crimes. Either way, they argued I was liable for their losses because my name was on all the documents. The lawsuit sought $18 million in damages plus legal fees. Even though I'd been a victim too, the investors needed someone to blame, and Grayson had successfully structured everything to make me the responsible party. My lawyer said we could fight it, but the legal costs would be devastating, and there was a real chance I'd lose everything even if I won. The Facebook group had grown to over 800 members, and people were posting increasingly detailed stories about Grayson's fraud. A pattern emerged of him targeting women entrepreneurs, gaining their trust through charm and apparent business acumen, then slowly taking over their financial operations. He'd done this in Seattle, Portland, Denver, Phoenix, and now here. Every city had the same story with different names and slightly different company structures. Some victims had lost everything and declared bankruptcy. Others had been charged criminally before prosecutors discovered they'd been manipulated. One woman had attempted suicide after losing her family's business to Grayson's fraud. Vanessa started getting death threats from people who believed Grayson's lawyer's story about her being a mentally ill stalker. Someone posted her home address online along with accusations that she'd fabricated evidence to frame an innocent man. Her car was vandalized twice in 1 week, and someone left a dead rat on her doorstep with a note saying stalkers deserved what they got. She moved into a hotel for safety, but the harassment continued with people tracking her location and posting it online. I invited her to stay at my apartment where at least we could watch out for each other. The building had security cameras and a doorman who could screen visitors. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and both Vanessa and I were required to testify. Grayson's lawyers filed motions to exclude all the documents she'd distributed, arguing they'd been obtained illegally and were inadmissible. They claimed Vanessa had hacked into Grayson's accounts and stolen confidential business information, making her a criminal rather than a whistleblower. The prosecutor fought back with evidence that the FBI had obtained everything legally through subpoenas once Vanessa had alerted them. But the defense kept pushing the narrative that this was a vendetta by an unstable ex-girlfriend who'd convinced a naive business partner that she'd been defrauded. 3 more victims came forward during the pretrial period. 2 women and 1 man who'd all been partners with Grayson in previous ventures. Each told the same story of trusting him with financial operations only to discover he'd stolen hundreds of thousands while framing them for the fraud. 1 woman named Carla had served 6 months in jail before investigators realized she'd been set up. She'd lost custody of her children during her incarceration and was still fighting to get them back 3 years later. She testified in a deposition about how Grayson had deliberately targeted her because she'd recently inherited money from her parents and was naive about business operations. The night before the hearing, someone tried to break into my apartment. Building security caught them on camera and called the police, but the person ran before officers arrived. The footage showed a man in a hoodie who'd been trying to pick my door lock for several minutes. Police said it was likely a burglar, but Vanessa and I both knew it was connected to the case. Grayson had a habit of intimidating witnesses, and previous victims had reported similar incidents before dropping their cooperation with prosecutors. We installed additional locks and a camera pointing at the door, but the harassment continued with threatening phone calls and emails from anonymous accounts. The hearing lasted 3 days with both sides presenting evidence and witness testimony. Grayson sat at the defense table looking calm and confident, occasionally whispering to his lawyers or taking notes. He'd lost weight since his arrest, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. When I took the stand, his lawyer hammered me about why I hadn't noticed the fraud if I'd truly been an innocent partner. He implied I'd been willfully blind or actively complicit, pointing to dozens of emails from my account that I couldn't remember sending. I explained that Grayson had access to my email and had been impersonating me, but the lawyer suggested that was a convenient excuse to avoid criminal liability. Vanessa's testimony was even more brutal. Grayson's lawyer spent 6 hours attacking her credibility, bringing up her hospitalization for depression after their breakup, and implying she'd fabricated everything because Grayson had ended their relationship. He showed the judge text messages where Vanessa had apparently admitted to following Grayson and monitoring his business activities. She tried to explain she'd been investigating his fraud pattern, but the lawyer kept circling back to the stalking narrative. By the end of her testimony, I could see the judge looking skeptical. The defense had successfully planted doubt about Vanessa's motives and mental stability. The FBI agents testified about their investigation and the evidence they'd gathered independently of Vanessa's documents. They'd traced $28 million through Grayson's network of shell companies and offshore accounts. They'd interviewed 43 people who'd invested money based on fraudulent promises. They'd documented 8 previous victims who'd been set up the same way I had. Jennifer explained how sophisticated Grayson's operation had been, using multiple layers of legitimate-seeming companies to hide the fraud. He'd hired real lawyers and accountants who'd unknowingly helped create the facade of legitimate business operations. The prosecution rested with clear evidence of systematic long-term fraud. The judge took a week to issue his ruling. He found probable cause for all charges and scheduled trial for 6 months later. But he also granted several of the defense motions excluding evidence that Vanessa had gathered before contacting the FBI. The judge agreed with the defense that she'd violated privacy laws by accessing financial records without authorization. This meant some of the most damaging documents proving Grayson's pattern couldn't be used at trial. The prosecutor was furious and filed an immediate appeal, but that process would take months. In the meantime, Grayson remained free on bail and was already rebuilding his public image. He did a podcast interview where he portrayed himself as a victim of a vindictive ex who destroyed his business and reputation with false accusations. He talked about struggling with the false charges and praised his new legal team for fighting to prove his innocence. The interview went viral, and suddenly public opinion started shifting. People who didn't know the details saw a successful businessman being targeted by a woman scorned. The comments section filled with support for Grayson and attacks on Vanessa, calling her a gold digger and a stalker. My name got dragged into it too, with people suggesting I was part of her conspiracy to frame him. The class action lawsuit against me proceeded despite the criminal case. The investors' attorneys argued my civil liability was separate from Grayson's criminal conduct. Even if he'd defrauded them, I'd still been negligent in not discovering the fraud sooner. My lawyer tried to have the case dismissed, but the judge said there were genuine questions about my oversight of company finances that needed to be resolved at trial. I was facing potential damages of $18 million with insurance that would only cover $2 million. My parents offered to mortgage their house to help with legal bills, but I refused to let them risk their retirement. I'd have to declare bankruptcy if I lost. Vanessa started a blog documenting Grayson's fraud pattern and the legal system's failure to protect his victims. She posted copies of public records showing his shell companies and the connections between his various schemes. The blog attracted attention from investigative journalists who started digging into the story. A reporter from a major news network contacted both of us about doing a feature on fraud victims and the challenges of prosecuting sophisticated white-collar crime. We spent hours being interviewed, and the segment aired 2 weeks later on their weekly investigative program. The coverage was balanced but devastating to Grayson's innocence narrative. His lawyers immediately sued the network and both of us for defamation, seeking $50 million in damages. They claimed the broadcast had destroyed Grayson's reputation and business prospects based on unproven allegations. The lawsuit alleged we'd conspired with the network to create a false narrative that portrayed Grayson as a criminal before he'd been convicted. Legal experts said the suit was frivolous and designed to intimidate us into silence, but defending it would still cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. The network's lawyers contacted us saying they'd cover our defense, but the harassment and stress continued building. More victims kept emerging as the news coverage spread. A total of 23 people contacted the FBI with evidence that Grayson had defrauded them over the past 15 years. The amounts ranged from $30,000 to $2 million per victim, with total losses exceeding $45 million. Some victims had been too ashamed to report the fraud initially or had been intimidated into silence by Grayson's threats. Others hadn't realized they'd been part of a larger pattern until seeing the news coverage. The FBI opened additional cases in 4 other states where Grayson had operated under different names. The scope of his crimes kept expanding with every new revelation. The trial date was pushed back twice as prosecutors added new charges and gathered evidence from multiple jurisdictions. Grayson's lawyers kept filing motions and appeals to delay the process. His family hired a public relations firm to manage his image, and they did a masterful job of keeping his name in the news as a victim of the justice system. They organized rallies outside the courthouse with supporters holding signs about false accusations and government overreach. Some of the supporters were paid actors according to investigative journalists, but others genuinely believed Grayson was being persecuted by angry ex-girlfriends and greedy investors looking for someone to blame. 11 months after the FBI raid, the trial finally started. The courtroom was packed with victims, reporters, and curious observers. Grayson had cut his hair short and wore glasses he'd never needed before, presenting himself as a professional businessman rather than the flashy entrepreneur he'd been. His lawyers spent 3 weeks presenting a defense that blamed everyone else for the missing money. They claimed his previous partners had stolen from the companies and were now trying to frame him. They suggested I'd been skimming funds and had panicked when Vanessa started asking questions. They portrayed Vanessa as mentally unstable and obsessed with destroying Grayson after he'd rejected her. The prosecution spent 4 weeks methodically destroying each defense claim with bank records, email forensics, and testimony from forensic accountants who'd traced every dollar through Grayson's complex network. They showed the jury how he'd created identical shell company structures in 8 different cities. They presented evidence of him forging signatures and creating fake companies using stolen identities. They played recorded phone calls where he'd lied to investors about project status and financial returns. By the time they rested, the evidence was overwhelming and clearly demonstrated a deliberate, sophisticated fraud operation spanning over a decade. I testified for 2 full days about our partnership and how Grayson had gradually taken control of all financial operations. I explained how he'd gained my trust through small projects before suggesting we expand into bigger developments. I described discovering the fraud through Vanessa's envelopes and how my initial reaction had been to defend Grayson because I couldn't believe someone I'd trusted would betray me so completely. The prosecutor walked me through dozens of forged documents with my signature, showing the jury how Grayson had stolen my identity to commit fraud. The defense tried to suggest I'd been complicit, but the email forensics proved the messages had been sent from IP addresses I couldn't have accessed. Vanessa's testimony lasted 3 days because the defense kept trying to impeach her credibility. They brought up her depression treatment and medication, suggesting she'd been delusional when making accusations against Grayson. They showed her social media posts about him from years ago, taking them out of context to make her seem obsessed. But the prosecution rebuilt her credibility by showing she'd been right about everything. Every warning she'd tried to give me had been accurate. Every document she'd distributed had been genuine. The FBI had verified everything she'd claimed. The jury could see the defense was trying to shoot the messenger rather than address the message. The jury deliberated for 18 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 43 counts, including wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy. Grayson showed no reaction when the verdicts were read, just staring straight ahead while his lawyers immediately began discussing appeal strategies. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and revoked bail, sending Grayson to jail to await sentencing. As marshals led him away in handcuffs, he looked directly at me and mouthed something that looked like, "This isn't over." Vanessa grabbed my hand and we both started crying, not from relief but from exhaustion after nearly a year of fighting. Sentencing day brought all 23 identified victims to the courthouse to deliver impact statements. Carla talked about losing custody of her children and serving jail time for crimes Grayson had committed. Diana described losing her home and her marriage. Paul explained how draining his retirement account had left him unable to afford medical care for his wife's cancer treatment. Each victim shared devastating stories about how Grayson's fraud had destroyed their lives financially, emotionally, and socially. The judge listened to every statement before addressing Grayson directly about the magnitude of his crimes and the calculated cruelty of his methods. The judge sentenced Grayson to 28 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 18 years. He ordered $31 million in restitution to be paid to victims, though everyone knew Grayson had hidden most of the money in offshore accounts that might never be recovered. Additional sentences for identity theft and money laundering would run concurrently. The judge noted that Grayson had shown no remorse and had actively tried to intimidate witnesses and obstruct justice throughout the legal proceedings. As marshals led him away, Grayson finally showed emotion, shouting at the judge that he'd been railroaded by corrupt prosecutors and crazy women. The civil lawsuit against me was dismissed 3 weeks after Grayson's conviction once the judge reviewed evidence proving I'd been a victim, rather than an accomplice. The investors were angry but understood they'd been misled by Grayson's deliberate structuring of shell companies. Some of them joined a class action against Grayson's family members who'd posted his bail, arguing they'd known about the fraud and should be held liable. That lawsuit was still pending but unlikely to recover much given how well Grayson had hidden his assets. Most victims would never see full restitution. Vanessa and I started speaking at fraud prevention conferences about our experiences and how sophisticated criminals could manipulate trusted systems. We explained how Grayson had exploited normal business practices to commit fraud over many years while hiding behind legitimate-seeming structures. We warned entrepreneurs about protecting their identities and maintaining oversight of financial operations even with trusted partners. Some conferences paid modest speaking fees that helped cover our ongoing legal bills from the various lawsuits. We'd both declared bankruptcy to deal with debts Grayson had created in our names. The defamation lawsuit Grayson had filed against us was dismissed after his conviction, but not before costing the news network over $300,000 in legal fees. They wrote a follow-up story about how defamation lawsuits were often used to silence fraud victims and intimidate journalists. The story mentioned that 12 of Grayson's previous victims had been sued when they tried to warn others, and most had settled rather than face lengthy court battles. The lawsuits were part of his intimidation strategy to maintain his reputation while continuing to defraud new partners. This pattern needed to change to protect future victims from similar abuse. 2 years after thanking my stalker on social media, I stood with Vanessa at a victims' rights conference where we shared our story with 200 attendees. We explained how my sarcastic post had accidentally forced the evidence into the open earlier than planned, preventing Grayson from destroying more documentation but also complicating the FBI investigation. We talked about how our initial antagonism had transformed into partnership as we both fought for justice. Several attendees approached us afterward sharing their own stories of being defrauded and feeling powerless against sophisticated criminals who use the legal system to avoid accountability. We exchanged contact information and started building a network of fraud victims helping each other navigate the complex path toward justice and recovery. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.